Hiyori will be making a guest appearance in this video because she's kind of pretty important to the first part of it. Mostly just because of the fact that this will be talking about the second part for Kawamatsu, going over from when he is charged with taking care of Hiyori all the way up until just before the Battle of Onigashima. And he's got a pretty packed 20 years for everything that happens to him, to be fair. So do a lot of the other Scabbards, like I mentioned with Ashuradoji and with Denjiro and such, for everything that they go through in that time frame. And, you know, Inarashi and Nekomamushi, all that stuff. So, into this, so when I last left, at the end of the last one, we had it that Kawamatsu had been tasked with caring for Hiyori and raising her through the next 20 years, as the others, along with Momonosuke, were sent into the future for 20 years ahead into the future. They managed to escape the castle by diving into the moat, and because, of course, you know, Hiyori doesn't have a devil fruit, neither does Kawamatsu, plus Kawamatsu's a fishman, he's able to get out of the water very quickly and get it, so they are now both in hiding. From there, it kind of goes semi-okay for the first couple of years. For the first 7 years, things go decent. Well, decent enough considering the circumstances. And Kawamatsu is, you know, he spends the majority of his time, of course, trying to keep Hiyori happy, along with trying to find enough food for her. And of course, Hiyori notices this. First of all, and of course I'll go into this when I get to the Hiyori videos, when I talk about her. She, of course, figures out pretty quickly, because she's 6 when this starts. By the time she's 7, she's now 13. Or by the time, you know, 7 years have passed, she's now 13. And, you know, she's figured out the fact that, like, Kawamatsu is not eating properly because he is giving her the food, and then he's kind of, like, starving himself, and she's figuring this out. Because, you know, with the way that Orochi and Kaido have been poisoning the landscape, it has made it harder and harder for them to be able to find food that they can actually eat and water that they can actually drink. Not as bad as it ends up being later on by the time we get to, like, what Tama has to go through, but it's still very, very bad for the environment and for the country as a whole. And so Hiyori and Kawamatsu are suffering during this time frame, but Kawamatsu is, you know, he does his, you know, his kappa dances and stuff like that, trying to cheer Hiyori up. To be fair, she just lost her father, her mother, her brother, and a good chunk of the people that she considers family got sent into the future, and she has no idea if she's ever going to see any of them again, and several other members of the ones that she considers family are not there either, because they've, like, vanished into thin air. To be fair, there's, like, a bit of a what-if scenario here, where if Kawamatsu had managed to find Ashuradoji, or if he'd managed to find Denjiro during this time frame, then maybe something could have been shifted in there for what could have happened. But as I said, with, you know, with the other two, they're pretty much isolated, each of them in their own areas, from each other during this time frame. They don't interact with each other or anything like that, because of course Denjiro is, you know, being undercover basically as, you know, Kiroshiro, and then Ashuradoji takes up the name of Shutenmaru, and then Kawamatsu later on will take up, you know, a title as well when he, you know, becomes like the guardian of the bridge, stealing weapons from people, which we'll get to in a moment. But once we hit the 7-year mark for, you know, that 7th year range, Hiyori is like, no, she's like, okay, I can't stay here anymore, because if I stay here any longer, Kawamatsu is going to starve to death. So she, you know, writes him a letter, and then she heads off into town, where she thankfully heads off into the flower capital, where she thankfully ends up getting found by Denjiro. And of course I'll go into more detail about that. I talked about that with Denjiro already, and then of course I'll talk about that more when I get to the Hiyori videos, which will be probably the last couple that I do for this series, for the Wano section. But So then after this point in time, Kawamatsu is like, uh, he finds a letter and he just cries because he loves Hiyori like a niece, and the way that the rest of the Scabbards do, minus Kanjuro. He adores Hiyori, and during this time frame, he's been her guardian for the last 7 years and has done his best to try to take care of her. Unfortunately, his best kind of isn't good enough. Not through any fault of his own, obviously, but he is just devastated by the fact that, like, oh no, Hiyori's gone. What am I supposed to do now? I need to go find her. So he goes and he tries to search through her across Wano, trying to find her, and he, it doesn't go well, and eventually he ends up in the Ringo region because he's like, okay, I can't find Hiyori. And there's still 13 more years left until the others are supposed to arrive in the future. And, and he would be aware of, like, Toki's prophecy and stuff like that, because he probably would have, like, heard about it. So he's like, okay, I need to find something to be useful. And it is that mindset of, like, I have to be useful. I have to find something that I can do that will be useful in trying to help in the revolution that we're going to have, in the rebellion. I have to figure out something. So he ends up making his way to the Ringo region, to the graveyard, and he ends up wanting to collect swords. Now, before he starts collecting swords, the first thing that he comes across is Onimaru, who's the fox, that has the, shape-shifting abilities, is one way to put it. He has a devil fruit power. And he finds Onimaru, and Onimaru is very badly hurt. And Kawamatsu bandages him up and starts nursing him back to health. Because Onimaru had been acting like this guardian of the graveyard because, the beast pirates kept showing up and trying to steal swords and weapons and stuff like that. Because, of course, as I mentioned in previous videos, in the Ringo region, obviously, this that's where the graveyard is, and you have the sword that you were given when you die. I don't know if this is supposed to be just the samurais or if it's like women too. I'm assuming it's supposed to be just like the men, but you're given this sword when you're born, and you have it until you die, and then when you die, it is stuck in your grave as your grave marker. It's what happened with Ryuma and Shusui, and probably what technically should have happened with, like, Odin, and then his swords with Enma and Ame no Habakiri. But besides that, Kawamatsu gets there, and Onimaru had been protecting it, and he got injured, so Kawamatsu bandages him up and starts nursing him back to health. Onimaru does not initially trust him, but Kawamatsu gives him these, the treats that he found, the treats that he stole, most likely, and, gave them to Onimaru, and that kind of, like, starts their friendship. Then Kawamatsu goes out and he starts trying to chip away at all of the swords, all of the katanas and the other weapons and stuff like that are stuck onto the graves. And of course, Onimaru takes this as, like, he's defiling the graves. And technically he is. He is defiling the graves by Wano custom. And Onimaru tries to stop him, and Kawamatsu, through this whole bit, like, Onimaru is, like, biting into one of Kawamatsu's arms, and Kawamatsu is trying to use the other one to keep trying to work. And, like, he explains to Onimaru what's going on. Now, Onimaru had belonged to the former daimyo of the Ringo region, who was... Frick, I knew this a while ago. I knew this before. What was his name? I had to know this for the other daimyo videos that I did. He's not the Izuku clan, Izuki clan. He is the Shimosuke family. He is, come on, he's not Ryuma. He's a descendant of Ryuma. He's the same way Zoro's a descendant. I know I have this here. Where did I put it? Ushimaru. Sorry. I had the names in my head and I'm just like, that's not it. That's not it. That's not the right one. That's not the right one. There we go. Ushimaru. And so he's the former companion of Ushimaru, who of course died when him and the other two daimyo went to go try to fight against Kaido, 7 years prior at that point in time. And he took it up, and Onimaru took it up as his job to defend the graveyard. And Kawamatsu is like trying to explain to Onimaru what's going on. He's like, okay, so you know that our country has been invaded. You know that we are under threat. You know that we are being slowly destroyed from the inside. Blah, blah, blah. It's like he's trying to explain this to Onimaru, and he is able to convince Onimaru that he's like, I know it's wrong to dig up these swords, but we are going to need these weapons when we fight against Kaido, when we fight to overthrow Orochi and take down Kaido. We're going to need these weapons to arm the rebellion, because Orochi, unless you're willing to like work for Orochi, you're not allowed to have a katana. Zoro gets away with it because he's Zoro when they're undercover, but because he's Zoro. But the others, the most of the other samurai and stuff like that don't really have that option. And unless they're willing to like work for Orochi, like the not the Oniwabanshu, Mimawari Gumi. And what ends up happening, of course, is Kawamatsu is able to convince Onimaru that he to help him. And like Kawamatsu is like, I don't like that I have to do this, but I have to, because if I don't, then these swords are gonna get they're lying in waste here, and I think our ancestors would like us to use them to try to protect our country. And that's what ends up happening, of course. Him and Onimaru work on gathering up the swords, getting them off, getting them out of the ice and snow and everything, and start getting them restored and cleaned up and everything, and set aside in part of the shrine area that's there. And then of course there's the grave robbers that keep trying to show up to the graveyard, and Kawamatsu takes on the name of Gyukimaru as the bridge bandit, as the guardian of the bridge, and they continue to steal the weapons from any of the grave robbers, beast pirates and stuff like that show up, and fight them and scare them off and take their weapons. And then they of course add those weapons to the pile that they've already made, to the stash that they already have. And this goes on for not quite a whole year, but they get a good chunk of time. And Kawamatsu keeps going to town and stealing more food for them to be able to eat. And eventually, unfortunately, Kawamatsu gets caught. And this ends up, and he gets caught and he gets taken to Udon prison, where he is chained into this cell in isolation, in darkness the whole time, most likely darkness the whole time. And upon Orochi's orders, who's probably figured out who Kawamatsu is he's a member of the Scabbards. I know. And his punishment is that he is given one fish, and it's a poisonous fish, and it's supposed to be a boneless fish. We see that some people F up on this later. It's supposed to be a boneless fish, and I think that's supposed to be this I don't know if it's one poisonous fish a day, one boneless poisonous fish a day, or if it's one every so many days, or that's just his meal, every that's what his meal is. But it's intended to slowly poison him. Now, Kawamatsu is a Japanese pufferfish fishman, is what he's based on. So he already has, to a degree, some form of a natural immunity to poison, because pufferfish are poisonous. That's one of the famous things about pufferfish, is that if you eat them and if they're not prepared correctly, then it can be very dangerous and it could kill you, just because of how poisonous they are. But Kawamatsu is he's not immune to it, but he I guess has enough of a built-in tolerance that he's able to continuously build that up during the time that he's, the next 13 years that he's, captured, being held prisoner in the Udon prison. And, he's just, he's left to, like, with his own mind is, like, what he is left with. And with watching through the windows, through his bars, as so many of the citizens of Wano, who probably did nothing more than slightly defy Orochi or just, slightly anger a beast pirate or something, and now they've been shoved in here and forced as like slave labor, to work for work so much and barely get anything to eat. And Kawamatsu is forced to watch this through the bars, which is just an additional layer to his punishment. And he's just left there to like wallow in his own mind for this time frame. And just like the way is just like, I mentioned this with a bunch of the other Scabbards, that like, for the ones who had to wait the 20 years, I wonder how many times Kawamatsu kind of hallucinated Odin showing up or something along those lines. I wonder how many times that kind of happened for him, or one of the other Scabbards or something. But he kept fighting, and he stayed alive for those 13 years. And then we get to the present, during the Wano arc. We get to when Luffy is brought to Udon prison. And this is technically our initial introduction to Kawamatsu. And we have it that one of the guards is like, feeding him a fish, feeding him the poisonous fish. Unfortunately, this guard is either new or not paying attention to the rules that have been set out ahead of him, or set out for him, because he does not debone the fish. He just tosses it in. Kawamatsu eats it, and then when one of the guards tries to attack Luffy, Kawamatsu just spits out the bones, like fishbone whole, and like stabs the guy in the neck with it. And, so he does that to, like, defend Luffy at that point in time when Luffy was going to be attacked. And it's just like, yeah, Jim, that's why we debone the fish. Have you learned that now? Yeah, I get it now. We debone the fish before we feed it to the guy in the cell. Got it. And, Kawamatsu was kind of just, like, observing what's going on with Luffy and Kid, confront Dobon to protect Hirogoro and everything. And then, of course, when Luffy and Hirogoro are now in the the sumo inferno thing that Queen sets up, Kawamatsu is like watching this, and this is when Raizo is like running around trying to find where the keys are and other information like that. And Kawamatsu calls over, and Raizo comes over, and he looks in the cell, and he realizes that it's Kawamatsu in the cell, and he's like, oh, my friend, I've missed you so much. And he reveals that himself, along with all the others, are there, and that Momonosuke is okay and everything, and that's like just this big relief for Kawamatsu at that point in time. And he's like, don't worry, I will get you out of this cell once I find the keys. And Kawamatsu's like, that's fine, I appreciate it. And then, that kind of just keeps going. And what ends up happening is, Kawamatsu is just kind of like an observer for what's going on until Big Mom shows up, and she just does, like, her rampage through the prison. And this, of course, ends up resulting in the cell gets destroyed, so Kawamatsu is freed, and assumedly, like, enough of the shackles are broken that he's able to get out. And Kawamatsu had kind of been watching as, Luffy and the others, or not Luffy and the others, but as, Babanuki on Queen's orders were using the plague bullets to infect people, and including Luffy in that regard. But Kawamatsu gets freed from the cell, and of course this is when he's reunited with Kiku and with Raizo again. And then they have, like, the great standoff moment where it's, Kawamatsu and Luffy and Kiku and Hirogoro and Raizo and Chopper and such. It's like the 360 shot of them in the prison yard getting ready to try to take down the Beast Pirates, Babanuki and the others, and then they get attacked by all the ones who have been turned into, the hit with the plague bullets and everything. And, Kawamatsu managed to, of course, or, not Kawamatsu, Raizo got a hold of Sotomuso, which is, of course, Kawamatsu's sword, so he gets that back, and he's freed and everything, and they have, like, the great 360 thing where they're all together, and, of course, Kawamatsu helps with taking out several of the low-ranking beast pirates. We get to see like a show of his strength and skill and everything, which is good. And then of course he does witness as like Luffy assuades the prisoners to help them by like infecting himself and then like gaining their trust and then tying up Babanuki's trunk to prevent him from firing that. And then he's like very impressed with this, and he's again just like observing kind of what's going on. He knows he stays there for long enough to see that Luffy has been cured of the poison and that the rest of the former prisoners who had been infected by the plague bullets are like healed and such by Chopper. So we get to see so he's there for that. And then, he's told about the plan for like, okay, well, our plan is that, in like 2 weeks or whatever the time frame is, during the Fire Festival, we are going to, that's something. Okay, pausing for a moment and going back a bit. When, during the time frame that Kawamatsu is taking care of Hiyori, the Fire Festival probably would have started already by then. So I wonder if there were any points during the Fire Festivals, those, 6-7 years, depending on, how everything lands, if, Kawamatsu would have, like, risked trying to, like, sneak Hiyori into the capital so that way they could, enjoy the festivities and eat and drink, and everything else like that, and just have some fun. I wonder if he ever did that. That's kind of just like a side thought of like, I wonder if he ever did manage to pull that off. To be fair, that would have been a pretty decent time to try to steal food, since it's a lot more, available during that time frame to the citizens, even if they're the poorer citizens. But back to this. And Kawamatsu's like, okay, he's like told about the plans for the Fire Festival. He's like, okay. And he's like, well, I may have a place for us to get weapons from, so I'm gonna go check on that. And like, Kiku's like, okay, don't worry, I'll, inform, Kinemon and the others that you're alive. And he's like, okay. And he then heads, makes his way to the Ringo region, to the Ohagi Bridge, and where he sees Zoro a fight. Well, I think he witnesses part of the fight of Zoro. No, this is after that fight, because this is after Zoro has already fought against Killer as the Scythe Killer. Blanking on his name, don't care. After Zoro's already done that, and he's been, kind of, patched up by Hiyori and everything, and gotten back to the Ringo region. And Zoro is trying to fight against Gyukimaru in order to try to get his try to get Enma back, or not Enma back, to get Shusui back. And what ends up happening is, of course, Kawamatsu shows up and he interrupts the fight between them. I think because also like some beast pirates show up, so like Zoro and Kawamatsu work together to like take out the beast pirates, and then Kawamatsu is reunited with Hiyori. After the 13 years, she just runs up to him and hugs him, and she's just so happy to see him, and he is just so relieved that she is okay and that she is alive. And, he's just, like, so relieved by that, and he runs up and and they hug each other, and they're reunited and everything. And, he's like, I'm just so happy that you're okay, and she's like, I'm just so happy to see you again and know that you're okay, too. And so they have that wonderful reunion there between Hiyori and Kawamatsu, which I love. And then they're like, okay, well, why are you even here? And he's like, okay, well, I actually kind of stayed here for a while after I lost you, or after you ran away. And, he ends up, they see Gyukimaru, and Gyukimaru flees. And then, Kawamatsu, Hiyori, and Zoro are making their way through the graveyard, and like Zoro's talking about like, I just want to get my sword back, and Kawamatsu's kind of like, what sword? And he's like, oh, it's called Shusui. And he's like, why do you have Shusui? That was stolen like 25 years ago. Why do you have that? Type of a thing. And so like Zoro has to give like the basic explanation, and Hiyori's like, okay, Zoro, I'm gonna make you a deal. Since you saved me from Kamazo or whatever, and the other Beast Pirates, and you've helped with that, and you're clearly helping our citizens and everything else like that, and your crew's going to be helping. In exchange, if you return Shusui as this national symbol of Wano, this national treasure, I will give you Enma, which was the sword that was that I inherited from my father, from Kozuki Oden. And like Kawamatsu's kind of like the witness to this deal, and Zoro's like, a sword wielded by Kozuki Oden. And like Zoro would have like heard because Kinemon explained to the Straw Hats in the two separate groups about the history of Odin and everything, and so Zoro would have known about that from like what Kinemon told them when they first got to Wano. And so he's like, a sword wielded by Kozuki Oden. That could be a very good addition to my collection. And it ends up being a very good addition to the collection, so they agree to the exchange. And Kawamatsu was kind of the witness for this. And then so he's kind of like going to be like the eyewitness of like, yes, I solemnly swear to tell the truth. Yes, Hiyori made this deal with Zoro, blah, 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 blah. That's like the kind of the deal that they come up with. But during this time frame, while they're going through the graveyard, he also tells Hiyori about Shimasuke Ushimaru and his connection to Onimaru, and explaining about that. And they go through the passageway down into like part of the shrine area, the underground chamber in the shrine. And Kawamatsu gets down there, and he is just blown away by how many weapons, swords, spears, whatever, are just all over the walls, perfectly fixed, in perfect condition, all over the walls. And he is just amazed by this. And he ends up, using the pond snails to call Kinemon, and he tells him, oh, I have weapons. We are good on weapons. And like, he's just sitting there looking at this room full of these weapons. And he's like thinking, it wasn't anywhere near this full 13 years ago. What happened? And he puts together that during the time frame that he was in Udon, that Onimaru must have kept gathering the weapons and cleaning them and preparing them and putting them here. Well, also, and like, we know that like he's also like the Gyukimaru of the bridge, as he becomes that. His devil fruit allows him to become like this bridge-looking bandit, and he stands there and steals swords and stuff like that from the grave robbers or the beast pirates that try to show up and defeat them. And then he brings them back, and he puts them here and like keeps an eye on them. And I love that about Onimaru. I love Onimaru. He is such a good doggo, foxo, whatever you want to call him. He is such a good boy. And like Kawamatsu like puts this together, and he's like, oh my god, he kept working. He kept doing this. He kept going on the mission that I like tried to start, and Onimaru is the one who like kept going. And I love that. Like in the episode, we see like the Gyukimaru turn back into Onimaru, and like we see him kind of off to the side, and he's just like so happy that Kawamatsu is back. I don't think they actually fully reunite until after the Battle of Onigashima, but they might. They might reunite because like Kawamatsu. Because like after Kawamatsu, calls Kinemon and explains to him that yes, they have weapons, and of course that's I think after that is when like Hiyori and Zoro make the deal for the trade for Shusui for the Enma. And, from there and everything, it's Hiyori tells Kawamatsu and Zoro, don't tell the others that you know where I am. You can tell them that I'm alive, but I'm not going to be joining you guys, and like don't tell them where I am, because she doesn't want them to distract them from like preparing for the war. And Kawamatsu and Zoro, they do make their way to Amagasa village, where Enma happens to be in the hands of Hitetsu, but we know that Hitetsu is actually Sukiyaki, so it kind of makes sense that he would have the swords. Still have no flippin' idea how he got the swords. That's never been explained. But they make their way there. They explain that yes, Hiyori is alive. She made this deal with Zoro, so he's gonna get Enma, and Tenguyama is like, yeah, okay, so here's the sword. You made the deal. We're good. Kawamatsu's the witness, and Kawamatsu explains to the others that yes, Hiyori is still alive, and they're all just overjoyed about this. But he clearly does not tell him, and Zoro clearly do not tell them where Hiyori is, or the fact that she was Komurasaki for the past 13 years. That she had this, other identity. They don't tell them any of that. To be fair, Kawamatsu would have no idea really who Komurasaki is. And Zoro, well, he would know who she is. That doesn't mean that he knows that it was Hiyori that was her, because I don't remember if she ever explains to Zoro that she was Komurasaki. But that's just, it was like, they don't say that. So then that means that Kanjuro is not able to then send a message to Orochi saying, hey, do you remember that courtesan that you were in love with? Yeah, the one that was supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world? Yeah. She's actually Princess Hiyori. She's not dead. She's hiding in the Ringo region. And if that had happened, if that had shifted, if that had been mentioned, then Orochi would have sent whatever number of military people all the way up to, the Onimabachu and the Mimo Origumi and whatever the beast pirates were at his control, sent them up there, raided the Ringo area, and just captured Hiyori. And brought her back, and then probably, forced her to become his bride. Even with her, because of how much he was in love with Komurasaki. And then, forced Hiyori to become his bride. Which is just sick. But that didn't happen, because Kawamatsu and Zoro don't say that she was Komurasaki, and don't give the exact location for where she was. So we know that during, the next 2 weeks for, prep before the Fire Festival and before the raid on Onigashima, they, Kawamatsu and the others help with gathering up all the different supplies and planning and everything else like that. Kawamatsu did witness, forgot to mention this for the time frame that he was being held at Udon. He would have watched on the screen the execution of Yasuie, because that happened before he was freed from the cell, so he would have been able to watch through the bars of his cell as Yasuie was killed. And he's just crying tears of just so much grief at that point in time, because he's just someone who was still around for Odin. Oh, that's not good. And then just the death of Yasuie and everything. So so he would have witnessed that, but he would have been part of gathering, making sure that they had all the weapons ready and getting everything ready for their troops. And then when it was the day before the raid, Kawamatsu, along with the rest of the Scabbards that were there, and Momonosuke and Shinobu, start making their way to the port where they believe they will be meeting everybody for heading out to go to head to Onigashima. They get there. There are no ships and no allies, and there's a storm going on the coast. And they're like, okay, so despite the setback, all of the Scabbards get into the boat. They leave Momonosuke on the shore with Shinobu, and they start heading their way to Onigashima. That's when that's when Kiku stands up, and she's grabs Kinemon. She's like, we have to figure out who the traitor is now. And that's when Kanjuro just reveals himself to be the traitor. And that's when Kanjuro reveals himself to be the traitor. They attack him. He's revealed to just be an ink painting. They look back toward the shore. They see that the real Kanjuro is there. He has trapped Shinobu in a snake painting that he made, painting of snakes that he made, and he is currently trying to get Momonosuke. Kawamatsu dives out of the boat, swims back to the shore, because he's the one who would get there the fastest, jumps up onto the shore and starts trying to fight, Kanjuro. And he ends up, I don't remember if he ends up managing to like at least kind of wound Kanjuro or not, but like they fight against each other. And this is like during this time frame is like when the Straw Hats and the others show up along with all of the rest of the allies that they had been waiting for show up. And so Kawamatsu went and tried to fight against Kanjuro, and Kanjuro manages to escape and fly off with Momonosuke. And of course, Kawamatsu's like, oh no, and all the rest of his captains are like, oh no, and Momonosuke's like, just focus on getting to the island. I will be fine. Good, brave boy. Get more into that when I talk about Momonosuke. So then Momonosuke has been taken. Kawamatsu gets back to where the others are. They all end up being, they're interacting with the Straw Hats and the Heart Pirates and the Kid Pirates and everything, along with the Minks and the rest of their allies that showed up, because now Kiyoshiro shows up with all of the other all the other samurais that he freed from Ratetsu Town, and reveals himself to be Denjiro, and that he is joining the ninja pirate Mink samurai alliance. So that's all going on, and then it's just like off to Onigashima, and like they explain about like we got your message, and it's different port than what you thought, and then it's like because luck is sometimes very much on Kinemon's side. The luck that everybody thought, oh, it's this port, and he thought it was this other port, and so that's where Kanjuro told like Orochi that they would be meeting, and like that's the thing that saves them. So it's like they go through all of that, and that is what will be leading into them heading, finished making their way to the Battle of Onigashima, which I will get to next time. So that's what I have for this. I thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.